Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much again for taking time to come join this series. We started this a couple of years ago, the Liberty and Energy Speaker Series. We're very passionate about those two topics. I think they're the main catalyst that changed life expectancy, global life expectancy, from 30 years to 73 years, after it's stagnant for tens of thousands of years, around 30 years. So the explosion of bottom-up social organization, human liberty, and the explosion of available, flexible energy really changed our world. So the talks are all different, but they're about those concepts, both of the growth of human liberty, the explosion of available energy. So today is very energy-focused, very energy-focused. I went to college as a kid. There was a mania in the 80s that we were running out of energy, running out of oil and gas and farmland and fertilizer. Industrial civilization was going to collapse and mass starvation was soon to arrive. These stories seem to repeat themselves, but that was quite prevalent when I was in high school here in Denver in the 1980s. And to me, the answer to that was the next generation energy. And I went to MIT specifically to work on nuclear energy. So I've been passionate about nuclear energy since I was probably 15 years old. I didn't have a career in it. You're going to hear today from a friend and partner of mine who has had a career in it, and I think that the tremendously exciting future it could have. Real quick, why does energy matter? Why do we need more energy? Today, 5 billion people, almost 2/3 of humanity, are walking around in clothes that were washed by hand. Well, why did they spend hours a day to wash their clothes by hand? Lack of access to energy and the wealth that energy access brings. So those 5 billion people, they want to wash a machine too. They want a lot of other things we have today. So the world needs massively, massively more energy. About 14 years ago, the world consumed about 500 exajoules of energy per year. And today we've gotten to 600 exajoules. Incredibly important to raise standard of living and maintain our standard of living. We've got to get to 800 exajoules of energy, global energy produced by the year 2050. Well, where is that extra 200 exajoules going to come from? Where's it going to come from? If you look at the last 12 years, where did the last 100 exajoules come from? Incremental energy. Nearly 80% of it from hydrocarbons. They're about 80% of total global energy. No change in market share. They're the dominant drivers of the growth in energy and the existing energy. We get 9% from solar, 7% from wind of just that growth, but at great destruction. More expensive electricity, destabilized grids. Together, after $4.5 trillion of investment, they're just over 2% of global energy. We're not going to get a lot of those 200 extra exajoules from those sources. I think that's a reasonably safe bet, given what's happened in the last 20 years. So what about nuclear? This is dense, it's reliable, it works when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing, doesn't take a massive amount of land. We have an enormous amount of fuel and rapidly advancing technologies. Well, the story of nuclear, in the year 2000, nuclear was 6% of total global primary energy. 6%. What is it today? 4%. 4% of, well more than wind and solar, but only 4% of total global primary energy, because it hasn't grown in the last 15 years, and the total pie of energy has grown, so its market share has shrunk. I'm passionate about seeing that change. We need a lot more energy in the world. It can't all come from hydrocarbons. Nuclear has a bright future, but we have to make that future happen. Fortunately, there's a lot of exciting new businesses and entrepreneurs trying to bring next generation reactors. Hard to build big things today. Regulatory costs, protests. It takes forever to build anything of scale in our country today. That's a whole separate topic, maybe of a future talk. But I think the future of nuclear is in small modular reactors, manufactured, built quickly, and in smaller things. So I surveyed about 6 or 7 of the small modular reactor companies starting about 2 years ago. It shows Oklo, I think, has the best technology. You're going to hear all about that. Fast neutron, high energy density. Actively, if everything goes wrong, it just shuts down. Inherently safe and the right commercial model. To build nuclear, you've got to get through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They have issued 0 permits in their 45-year history. So that's an uphill battle. That is an uphill battle. Jake and Carolyn are going to talk about that today. But if you can get through that, if your next step is to deal with a utility, which is another almost quasi-government entity today where they're told what to do and what not to do, that to me is a slow road. Oklo's model is get through the NRC, build the reactors, own the reactors, and sell electricity contracts. And boy, as you'll hear, the hands in the air, sign me up for firm, reliable electricity is massive. Our electricity grid has not had a great decade, and now we're entering a period of growth. Big challenges ahead. But I want to welcome to the stage Jake DeWitte, who, like me, is a fellow MIT engineering nerd, studied nuclear engineering at MIT, and met a fabulous gal there who also studied nuclear engineering at MIT and is co-founder and wife. And we also have Brian Gitt. You'll hear from Brian at the end, the VP of Business Development of Oklo. So we got 3 of the key executives in the company. Ask a lot of great questions at the end, but enjoy what I think will be a fabulous talk from Jake. Jake, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. Should have got me mic'd up on this. Oh yeah. I'll mention that. Also, a very exciting part of this is we just completed a de-SPAC merger with Sam Altman, his SPAC vehicle. He was also the chair of our company. And we're very excited that now that we're a public company, we also have Chris Wright on our board. So thank you for serving with us there, which has been pretty cool. We closed that transaction about 6 weeks ago. So we're 6 weeks into the public company experience. But going to sort of the real big story of what we're up to here and why we started this company. I think the one thing, I first met Chris about, I guess that was 15 months ago here in Denver. Sort of coincidentally, it happened to be the case that I was in town. And was very excited about his view on energy because it resonated with mine, albeit from a little bit different perspective of how I got really excited about energy. In other words, I went to MIT when there was more opportunity in nuclear, so I got to work on it. But now we get to have you work on it with us now. So it all comes full circle. So I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so about 6-7 hours down the road. Born and raised there, fell in love with nuclear technology from a very young age, largely because of the sort of legacy that the Manhattan Project had there. If you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, you can see sort of that touch point, obviously the history of the Manhattan Project with Los Alamos, Sandia National Labs, those 2 things. So I would go to the National Nuclear Science Museum, used to be the Atomic History Museum, when I was a kid, often. And I was captivated by what felt like science fiction, but was real. Because what I learned from a very young age was you can do this thing where you can take an atom and split it and produce 50 million times more energy than when you normally would chemically sort of combust or oxidize a hydrocarbon. 50 million times is an insane multiple on something. And it's hard to get your head around. In fact, it's the same like multiple at the difference between the speed at which an average person can run sort of at their highest, at their fastest, and the speed of light. That's an insane shift, right? Hard thing to like actually capture. So for me, I fell in love with that. And it seemed like science fiction, but was real, and I knew I wanted to work on it. So from that sort of experience I got set up on a journey where I got some really unique experiences, I guess, that come with growing up in New Mexico a little bit. I got hired into the nuclear weapons program when I was in high school. Weird, but cool experience. Getting a Q or top secret equivalent clearance when you're in high school and having an FBI agent visiting all of your friends who are high school students. That was an interesting experience, having the panic calls from the parents. The good news is there's so many people there who have that experience set that like half of them kind of know, like, oh, Jake's getting a clearance. And the other half like, what did Jake do? So that said, I got a chance to start seeing a lot of different facets of this industry from a young age. From there, I got the chance to work on sort of government R&D. I worked on academic R&D. I worked in industry on enrichment technologies for the enrichment plant in New Mexico that was in sort of the licensing and procurement stage when I worked with them. And then I also got the chance to work at GE on the reactor design side. And then later I got to work on the naval reactors on the design side there too. Along that path, let me back up. When I entered that path, I thought that I wanted to work on sort of what was going to be next in nuclear from a technological perspective. Mind you, this is in the 90s, early 2000s when I'm kind of moving into this space. And I was viewing nuclear as having sort of a significant upshift with new technologies driving that forward coming into the market. What I learned after spending a little bit of time in the industry was it wasn't going to be driven just by a new technology approach. It was an industry that had radically stagnated, there was huge opportunity to change things from the business model side, from the sort of technology side, from the go-to-market strategy, from the finance strategy, all the things that go into building a business. You can rethink a lot of those things because the industry had stagnated so severely. And that started to gnaw at me. I met my co-founder, Caroline, at MIT after going to grad school there. We ultimately started thinking a lot about this and realizing kind of this latent frustration of watching the industry kind of keep repeating the same things it had done over and over and over again and not reevaluating the opportunities in front of them to do things differently and better. And that ultimately put us in a spot where we decided, why not try to start a company here focused on sort of challenging some of those paradigms, which kind of manifests in three major ways that I'll talk about: the business model, size of the plants that we start with, as well as kind of the technology approach. So what we ultimately are focused on at Oklo is delivering at massive scales, reliable, low-cost, clean energy that can be there 24/7. As Chris said, really nothing has contributed more to sort of human development than having abundant energy that's affordable and sustainable. So let's make it even more affordable and more sustainable. At the, I don't know if I'd say 100,000 foot view, I don't know, maybe the 100,000 foot view is a way to think about this because it's a multi-billion year perspective. What we're working on is literally a technology that's been demonstrated and proven that can tap into known reserves of heavy metals that we can access on this planet, in other words, uranium and thorium, and power the entire planet's energy needs for billions of years, for the rest of the durable lifetime of the planet till the sun consumes it or makes it uninhabitable. That's pretty dang cool, right? Like, we don't need a breakthrough. This has been done. So it's just a matter of actually execution. Now, that's a little bit reductionist, but that is the mission that motivates us and what we're working towards. So what got me to fall in love with this, I talked about, was energy density. Just to manifest 50 million times, cool, but to manifest this a little more clearly, if you had a golf ball of uranium metal, that would have enough energy content in it with what we're doing to power your entire life's energy needs. Just a golf ball, right? And this stuff is pretty abundant material, actually. It's not that rare. So it's a hugely powerful source that also sets the stage for this to be such a sort of, I would say, will give us the competitive advantage we have from a technological perspective, from a density perspective. My view is, generally speaking, humans have tended to climb density curves in everything we do. Well, at least when we make progress. Maybe there's short starts and stops where we don't, but usually that's what we do. Semiconductors are obviously probably the fastest growth we've seen of that. But probably the only other thing that's rivaled that is the shift from the electron cloud, which is what we get our energy from everything else, into the strong nuclear force, right? That's in the nucleus, which is what nuclear taps into. And to me, the way I think about that then is that manifests in what I think the most fundamental metric for energy economics is, which is life cycle material usage. How many kilograms of concrete, steel, copper, fuel, so on and so forth do you need per, in this case, gigawatt hour of energy you produce over its life cycle? And if you compare across all energy sources, fission by far requires the least. In fact, you really have to zoom in to see how much better it is than everything else. And that's great. In fact, it even, by the way, beats fusion. That's not to be super critical of fusion. It's just fission is really, really easy way to make heat, and you can harness it. So it really is one of the most sustainable sort of energy sources that there is. And scalable and therefore economic is how I look at it. So that's what got me to fall in love with it. And that's what got us to work on this. So I talked about this before. I kind of talked about just the macro set, the stage set. When we started the company, we really focused on sort of targeting three main areas we saw huge opportunities for. One was on the power sales model. So that's a business model, which is different than what's been done before. The other is technology, and the other is size. So quickly working through those. Typical nuclear that we had seen, and to date, pretty much what everyone else does in the nuclear space on the reactor design side, is that they design a nuclear reactor to about 80% completion, design the rest of the power plant to about 50% completion, maybe a little more. And then they go to their customers or prospective customers and ask them to pay them a couple $100 million for the customer to then take over all the work, to the customer to do the rest of the design, for the customer to site it, to permit it, to own it, build it, operate it, all those things. That's really highly frictional and is part of the reason that nuclear has not had a good time finding new markets to deploy into and growing even with utility markets. So our view was to say, let's make it easy to buy what people want, because people really do want the reliable, clean power that nuclear produces. So we decided to focus on a power sales model where we design, own, operate the plants and sell power through long-term power purchase agreements. This draws on parallels from renewables, it draws on parallels from other energy fields. Most importantly, though, it's what we found customers want. It also has a lot of other benefits. It helps us have recurring revenues. We can project finance against it. It gives us all sorts of things that really help us scale more quickly. But the main thing is it's what people want. So that's what we focus on. The other is technology. I'll talk a lot more about technology in the coming slides. But a focus we had was focusing on what technology has the right maturity mix with best of breed economic potential and scalability to it, which is what got us excited about liquid metal fast reactors. And then the other is size. Nuclear plants tend to have a view of being very large. I would argue that economies of scale are a real thing, but they're much more powerful for pressurized water systems, which is what today's reactor systems are. In other words, componentry that's pressurized typically has a strong function of getting a lot cheaper per unit capacity as they get bigger. That is not true for a liquid metal system, and that's a big benefit for us to stay small. But the other thing about being small is this changes the paradigm. One of the things nuclear's had a hard time getting through is actually the financing risk. This is one of the biggest things that's held up new nuclear deployments. The 2 plants we just turned online as a country in Georgia are fantastic to have online, but they came in at a cost of over $30 billion to build 2 gigawatts of capacity. That's not sustainable. That's not repeatable, right? That's just not doable. And there's a lot of things you can learn and avoid from that, but a lot of it gets into technology selections, and a lot of it also gets to size and how you approach building these things. Mega projects are hard. Cost overruns are almost inevitable in today's world. So we wanted to start as small as we reasonably could, but have a market to grow into. So not so small that it's a toy, like a 100 kilowatt system or something, but something that actually has a real market we can grow with, but will allow us to reduce the total amount of capital as well as the construction scope to be something that's totally palatable in the private market. And that's what we do starting at 15 megawatts. We also offer at 50 megawatts. But that's allowed us to reduce the total capital needs from a multi-billion-dollar project, which pretty much everything else has been in nuclear, to something that's a lot less. In other words, instead of starting a company and then needing a couple $1 billion to deliver your products, your first thing, which is a really hard thing to do, we said, let's change that so it's a few $100 million, which now we fully capitalized so that we can go build not only one, but actually well more than one based on the money we've raised to date. So we've kind of reduced that piece of the equation. So what we're working on, what this plan is the Aurora, is what we call it. So we call it the Aurora Powerhouse. We draw that name off of other energy sources where you basically are generating power from a building and call it a powerhouse. So we've seen this in diesel and gas and other sources or other energy fields. And in that, we have a little reactor that produces this heat that we turn into electric power. So how it was a little just high-level view. The plants, the 2 sizes we offer, 15 megawatts, 50 megawatts. They sit on a relatively small piece of land. The 50 does take a little more than 2 acres, but generally speaking, it's a small plot of land that you can build these plants. And then the total cost needed, the total capital, is quite approachable. So basically looking at about $70 million for the 15 megawatt plant for the early units. Those numbers drop at time and scale, and then about $120 million for the 50 megawatt plant that will then drop with time and scale as well as we grow those things. When I say scale, I mean volume of deployment. Being small also reduces construction timeframes, allows you to prefabricate a lot of things in a factory environment, allows you to ship in sort of optimal packages and reduce infield integration points, make it just easier and simpler. Plant can run for 40 plus years, and you refuel these things every 10 years, more or less. Depends on some specific requirements a customer can have, but 10-year refueling cycles. The building, generally speaking, fits on a pretty small footprint. You can imagine how this allows you to simplify the build process. When you're building a massive mega project, it's a lot harder than building a 10,000 square foot building. So, right, there's just a scope limitation here that keeps kind of a cap on what the overall project can look like. And that's hugely important on cost. So now diving into sort of the heart and soul of this thing, which is the reactor, which is what gets me very excited all the time. This is a small, fast reactor technology that leverages a long history of technology development behind it. So what I mean by this is a system that uses liquid metal as a coolant. So like liquid sodium. So it looks like that if you've seen Terminator 2, it's like the Terminator dude. It's not sentient and a dangerous robot, so don't think about that. But it's just a liquid metal coolant that's really good at moving heat. This was something that was envisioned by Enrico Fermi and some of his peers coming out of the Manhattan Project. The reason they liked it is because liquid sodium is so good at moving heat and operating at high temperatures that it opens up some very favorable characteristics from a plant design perspective. In other words, that allows you to run at high temperatures without being pressurized, and it's compatible chemically with commonly used stainless alloys like 304L, 316L, things that we use in many, many other industries and many other supply chains. And we know it works because we've built a lot of these things. So to dive into the system, there's a couple factors that kind of lend itself to have this best of breed economic capabilities. So first, not being pressurized and designing at a small size allows you to leverage all the benefits that small prefabricated non-pressurized componentry can afford you. Being able to use existing materials that other industries use, often oil and gas, right, is a huge opportunity to tap into the supply and value chains in oil and gas to use these kinds of components. At a simplistic reductionist level, this is basically a 50,000 gallon carbon steel tank. It's a double vessel system holding an internal 35,000 gallon stainless 304L tank with some relatively internal stainless structure and mounts inside, and then a nuclear fuel core at the bottom. Those are all things that look very common to what other industries use. This was important for us. We avoided what nuclear tends to do, which is overcomplicate academic and overly academify. I don't know if that's right. That's a made-up word. But make up kind of a much more complex design space because it's interesting, but it's not actually buildable. We focus on making this buildable. And then on top of that, liquid sodium, because of the benefits it has and because of the benefits of what a fast reactor is, it allows you to have these great inherent safety features where the system's self-stabilizing and self-cooling. That allows you to simplify the plant design and strip out these backup cooling systems and backup to backup cooling systems and so on and so forth that you would otherwise see. And you're just relying on natural forces like gravity and thermal expansion and thermal conduction and thermal convection, things that are frankly free, right, to have in the system. And that's a major way to reduce cost. So how it works. So this is a cutaway view of what our reactors looks like if you were to cut the vessel down the middle in half. In the lower part is where you have fuel. Those fuel is uranium zirconium alloy. It's held in fuel rods that are basically the diameter of my pinky about 8 feet tall. And there's about 7,000 of them arranged in a hexagonal honeycomb pattern. Between those, you have a little spacing, and that's where the liquid sodium flows, and it cools the fuel. Because in the fuel, what's happening is when you're splitting the atoms, you're producing heat, energy, mostly is heat, and that heat is conducted through the fuel to the sodium that's cooling it on the flowing on the outside of it. That sodium then flows up. It then flows down through heat exchangers that are at the top there. You see pipes coming out on the top there. That's then basically a second independent loop of sodium that's cooling the reactor. That internal sodium, that sodium that flows between the fuel, basically heat exchanger tubes, cools off and then flows back down to the bottom of the vessel and completes that loop that way. You also have control structures, some things that can drive power, control the power in the reactor, and some other instrumentation that you see on the top there. But overall, it's a relatively simple heat loop that produces heat on the bottom, transfers its heat at the top to a second loop of sodium that then goes and transfers its heat off to boil water, make steam and spin a turbine. But on top of that, what's really cool is the system can also achieve all the heat removal it really needs just by the natural flow of air around the vessel. So in a nuclear reactor, one of the things you have to design for is the ability to constantly remove heat, because when you turn off a nuclear reactor, you don't actually turn it off. It's still producing heat through the decay of the byproducts of the fission process. So when you split an atom, you produce usually two smaller atoms. They're radioactive, they're unstable, and as they decay, they're releasing energy. Most of that is manifest as heat. So you have to remove that. It's a small amount and it decays away exponentially, but you have to manage it. And it's enough of a thing that most of the events that have caused negative headlines and have been, sort of accidents in the nuclear space have been caused by the mismanagement of that decay heat. So it's great if you can manage that completely naturally just by air that's naturally flowing around the vessel, which we can do. And the reason we can do that is because we operate at higher temperatures. Heat transfer to air is ultimately dictated by the difference in temperature between the hot surface and the temperature of the air. The greater that difference, the more heat you can remove. You can do that in this system because we're running at higher temperatures and we're not pressurized, so we have thinner componentry. Water reactors can't operate at those temperatures to do that economically. So that's a great thing about these advanced reactors. That allows you to strip out a ton of things you would otherwise have in the plant to keep costs lower, but also basically put safety in a completely natural way on the side of sort of a physics-safe system. I like to say, hey, physics is really on our side here, which is not always the case in a lot of engineering, so it's kind of nice when you have that. So we talked about the flow of the coolant. I'm a big repetitive learner, so I tend to say things the same time multiple times over. But basically, the way this works is that internal sodium loop flows. One thing I didn't say is it goes, some people care about this, so it's fun to say it. It enters the fuel at about 350 centigrade and exits the fuel at about 550 centigrade. That's the temperature range in which it operates. And then those intermediate heat exchangers are where the heat's transferred to that separate loop of sodium, runs it a little lower, and then that boils the water like I talked about. So the way the airflow naturally cools the system that I talked about is the fact that there's air always around this vessel, but as it flows up the vessel, it does pick up heat. It gets hotter and it rises, just as hot liquids, hot airs, hot things tend to rise through buoyant forces. In so doing, it pulls cool air behind it. And that natural flow is always on. So you're always losing a little bit of heat, but it's a really small price to pay for all the benefits you get on this, which is tremendously important. So from that intermediate loop of sodium I talked about, that is a separate loop of sodium that carries heat from those heat exchangers to then basically these boilers and superheaters. That is all basically a skidded up design. looks very similar to what many other industries use for heat exchange processes. And then the steam goes to a power conversion system. We've been very excited about a partnership we developed with Siemens Energy. Siemens makes some of the best steam turbines in the world. They exited nuclear in 2011. They said there's no more business there. There's no more work they wanted to do there. They saw, though, sort of that wasn't necessarily a wise decision. It was very reactionary and partly driven by their home country's views. And what they realized was there was a lot of opportunity with these new nuclear systems going forward. So we were excited that we were their first announced partner to enter back into nuclear back late last year, and an announcement we had with a partnership there that we're very excited about as a preferred supplier on the steam turbine side. What's great about that is they provide the services to sort of design, build, own these things, help service, and they have a huge amount of data because these steam systems look almost identical to what they do on fossil-fired systems of the same conditions. And that's a really cool thing. We produce steam at very similar conditions that fossil-fired systems do. That's not true for most nuclear systems that operate at lower temperatures, so that gives us a lot of benefit there. And one thing that's really cool about this stuff that I talked about is it's proven technology. So all the stuff I talked about, all those great benefits, all these things are really neat to say. It's really, really important, though, because it's not just cool to talk about, it's been done. So there's over 400 reactor years of combined experience for fast reactors. By the way, I said fast reactor a couple times without exactly explaining it, but basically how to talk about it is when you split an atom, you produce 2 or 3 neutrons every time that happens. Those neutrons are born going very, very fast, about 10,000 miles per second. So really fast. What we do is tend to slow those down to make them easier to catch by the fuel by bouncing them off light things like hydrogen and water or carbon and graphite. That's how today's reactors largely work. But you can let them just run as they are fast. You just need more fuel. The downside is that you need more fuel, but the upside is when you let them run fast, they're much harder to intercept by the byproducts of the reactor or impurities in the reactor. That gives you a lot more leeway and flexibility. So that gives you a lot more opportunity to take advantage of these cool things fast reactors can do, like use fuel much more efficiently and even recycle waste, which is really cool. This technology has a long history behind it. In fact, the very first usable power ever made in the U.S. was from a small fast reactor in Idaho in 1951. The world has built more than 25 of these plants, and we specifically build off the legacy of successful demonstration of this technology after people who came before us iterated through what doesn't work and what does work, successfully culminating in sort of 2 major demonstrations in the U.S., one in Washington State, this one in Idaho that we build off of. This is the plant we most specifically drive our lineage from. We're building a 15 megawatt plant to start, followed by a 50 megawatt plant. They look very identical. We did that because it fits well within this EBR2 plant's envelope. So this was a plant that ran in Idaho for 30 years, produced 20 megawatts of electric power, sold it to the grid for 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and demonstrated these incredible characteristics, these inherent safety characteristics. It's the only technology consistently, not just this plant, but others, to have actually beaten light water reactors in terms of operating capacity factors and operational uptime. And it has the ability to run not just on fresh fuel, but recycled fuel, which is one of the really cool parts about how you manage the waste issue, but also extract a ton of value from it. So I'll talk more about that and the safety side before handing it over to Brian to talk more about the opportunity we see. So on the safety side, I talked a little bit about this, but just to get really specific, because it's kind of important here. What's great about this system is it's a physics-safe design that's self-stabilizing and self-cooling. What that means is that the reactor heats up, the fuel thermally expands, pushing itself further apart from itself, causing more neutrons to leave the core, get absorbed in shielding around the reactor, and shut itself down naturally. That's a great feature to have. On top of that, sodium is actually quite good at naturally flowing then through the fuel and removing all the heat through those same physics of natural convection that I talked about with the air. So the sodium does that inside the vessel and then transfers its heat to the air outside the vessel. This was all done before. This isn't new. This EBR2 did all of this, as well as a cousin plant in Washington called FFTF. Nuclear names are terrible. That's why we call it the Aurora and not some acronym. But all these plants did these amazing things, and you don't need pumps. You didn't need power. You don't need anything. All you need is the physics that are freely available to you. So this is actually something that has been done as well, which is really important, demonstrated at full scale. So EBR2 in 1986, specifically April 3rd, 1986, demonstrated this by going through 2 real-world tests, basically going through accident scenarios that would catastrophically destroy any of today's plants. Way worse than what Fukushima was. What it did was in the morning, they put the reactor up at full power. They locked the control rods out of the reactor, which are the things you normally would put in to shut it down, and they turned off the pumps. That causes you to not have the ability to cool the fuel actively anymore, which would cause the fuel to overheat. Well, that's exactly what happened, but the fuel overheated, expanded, pushed itself apart, shut itself down naturally, kicked into a natural circulation mode, and rejected all its heat naturally without a scratch. They went to lunch, they came back, turn the reactor back on to full power, lock the control rods out so they could not go in, and then shut off all power to the plant. That's like what happened at Fukushima, but way worse, because at Fukushima, what happened was they had shut the plant down for an hour before they lost power to the system. And then you had all the bad things happen. Here, they did it at full power without the ability to shut it down externally. So it was all natural phenomena. So what happens is you kind of bottle up the plant, it heats up, again, shuts itself down as it does that, cools itself naturally just to air that's always there and moving heat without a scratch. They went through 2 events that would catastrophically destroy any reactor in the same day without a scratch, and the fuel ran the rest of its lifetime without an issue. And that was a phenomenal achievement. 23 days later, Chernobyl happened. Not kidding. And so that kind of got lost a little bit in that, although some people did go and kind of say, hey, this looks like kind of what the future is. But then that kind of puts the question out there, okay, hey, all these things happened. Why didn't this technology get built before? And to put it simply, there's a long history we could talk about there, but to put it simply, it's because the industry did what it typically does. It took this great technology, put it through the same traps that it's used to running, bad business model, putting a lot of new technology into it to keep eligible for research and development funding. It just lost the opportunity here. I know this because I worked on this technology at GE when they were working on this. So that was why we focused on staying close to what's been done before and scale it accordingly from there. So what this kind of does is present sort of a very different paradigm in the world from what's been done before. First of all, you have all these great features of being small. You have all these great benefits of a different sort of business model. It changes the transactional approach. It makes it easier for customers to build. You have simpler plants that leverage existing supply chains with known materials because we've invested a lot of great effort and research with some of the best minds that have ever existed in these technologies coming out of the Manhattan Project. And now we're just taking a different approach on how we can actually bring these things to market. And one of the really cool things is on the waste side, what you can do with these next generation technologies is recycle it. And that's the last thing I'll say before I hand it over to Brian. This is one of the things that gets me very excited because when I think about resource efficiency, nuclear plants are really not good at that. They're just blessed by having a very energy dense fuel. What I mean by that is, imagine if you ran your car, but you had to dump your gas tank out after you only used 5% of it. It makes no sense, but that's just the way the system is built that way. That's what today's reactors do with fuel. In fact, all reactors are kind of limited. They only use about 5% of the energy content that goes into them. And then at the end, you have to take that fuel out and replenish it. Now, that means that used fuel is basically 95% unused fuel. So that's a huge amount of material you can pull out through recycling and actually use in a reactor system. The thing is, you can only do that if you have fast neutrons because you're sort of impervious to those impurities, as well as the fact that they have enough energy to change some of the nuclear physics of some of these isotopes. That allows you to tap into this massive opportunity that we consider waste right now and extract tremendous amounts of power. So you can take a recycling approach where you take the unused fuel out, reconstitute it, put it into our reactors, and you can literally produce enough energy from today's waste inventories in the United States to power the entire country's electric needs for 150 years. And every year our operating plants produce enough waste to power the country for 4 more years. So it's a pretty inexhaustible resource and something that we're pretty excited to tap into. And it's been done. In fact, it's being done right now as we speak in Idaho to produce fuel for our first plant, which we're very excited about. That's kind of the sort of story about what started the company, like how we thought of the company, how we started the company, what we're delivering. One of the things we've been very excited about now is almost coming up on 2 years now. We've had Brian Gitt on our team, who's been leading our business development and has been really finding that this is a very exciting moment for a lot of reasons for what we're developing and designing from a product side and a business model side to meet sort of the future of where we see a lot of energy consumption and demand going. So with that, Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk through a little bit of your story, of course, and also all the things you're seeing happening.
Thank you. By a show of hands, how many folks here work in the energy industry, whether that's oil and gas, whether it's utilities? Oh my gosh, almost everyone. Well, I'm going to tell you something you don't hear very often. Thank you. I am so grateful. I know you guys don't hear this enough, but honestly, everything that we care about in our lives is enabled by you in what you do every day. And I really want to express my gratitude for that. And we don't do that enough. We take this for granted. So thank you so much for not only the work you do and being here, and we're really excited because we are kind of moving and shifting into this new unprecedented area. And energy is so fundamental, as Chris opened up with. It's so important. When we think about what is energy, right? I mean, of course, it's the capacity to do work that you would see in a physics textbook, but it's way more than that. I think a clear definition, an expanded definition, is energy is freedom. And that's why Liberty Energy is the most perfect name of any company that I've ever could think about in the energy, because it's freedom. I mean, it's freedom from cold, it's freedom from darkness, it's freedom from hunger. It liberates us from domestic drudgery, from drinking dirty water, from suffering. It enables everything that we care about in healthcare and education. And when you choke off energy, you choke off freedom. And this is really critical. And that's why I work at Oklo. That's why I've worked in the energy industry for the last 25 years, because this is not only is just fascinating to me, an endless learning opportunity, but it's so fundamentally important to all of our lives. So I want to share a little bit. We're going to transition. Jake did a fantastic job telling you what this technology is and how it works and why in the origins of Oklo. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about what's happening in the market right now. What are we seeing? And what are these trends, and how does this technology play into that? There are two large converging forces that are smashing together right now. So the first is, over the last 20 years, power demand in the United States has been relatively flat. It hasn't grown a lot. And all of a sudden, we're seeing a massive surge in demand. And at the same time, we're having all of these large companies, Fortune 500 companies, I'm sure many of you in this room, have very aggressive emission reduction goals, right? I can't think of a single company out there, as well as all the government agencies. Everyone knows this, right? Well, these two forces are crashing together all at the same time and creating so much scarcity. Just to kind of level set this and give you an idea what we're talking about. Now, there's a ton of, you can talk to McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, all of these different organizations, but they all say basically the same thing. We're going to essentially triple the amount of electricity that we will consume just in data centers alone by 2030. And some of the estimates are more than that. In the United States today, we use about 20 gigawatts of power to power our data centers, and it's going to be about 60 to 70 gigawatts by 2030. I personally think, based upon my conversations with many of these companies every day, that it's going to be more than that. I think we're underestimating it. That's the equivalent of about 40 million homes. That is an incredible amount of power. And that's just data centers. Factories in the United States, almost nearly $500 billion has been committed to build new factories in industrial infrastructure in the United States. Well, that's also going to require a tremendous amount of energy. And what we've seen is all of these large companies, whether it's Google, Microsoft, Amazon, all of these companies are going around the country and land grabs, basically soaking up all the additional power they can get. They're buying any infrastructure they can get next to a substation or all land and trying to claim that power. Now, when we think, okay, so what are we going to do? We have all of this surging demand. We have all of these clean energy goals. We need to reduce our emissions. At the same time, well, what are the solutions to this? So new transmission lines, I'm sure as many of you are aware, take forever. It can take 10 years or more to build. So that's clearly going to be a bottleneck in the process. As many of you are probably aware, the EPA issued a new power plant rule a few weeks ago. This is going to force premature retirement of many of our thermal power plants in the United States. About 16% of the power plants are coal today, and many of the new natural gas plants that this rule will impact will require carbon capture and storage by 2032, which is going to increase the cost dramatically. And so a lot of our thermal power plants are going to be shut down. We're certainly not going to build more coal plants. I can guarantee you that. Wind and solar are great in terms of they don't emit any emissions, but they require the transmission. So you're not going to be able to triple the size of the electrical grid, which is what the Department of Energy estimates we would need to really deploy solar and wind at scale, because those resources are built in far out areas away from our homes and businesses. So you need to build the power lines. Well, we just said it's going to take over 10 years, if in best case, to build all that power infrastructure. Large nuclear plants are amazing assets for the United States. We have 94 operating nuclear reactors. We think at Oklo, we should build lots more large nuclear plants as well. We're very pro large nuclear plants. The reality, as Jake mentioned, though, is that with the recent experience in the West, and it's not true everywhere around the world, but in the West, It's just they're not hitting the schedule and budget. The cost overruns in Vogtle, 7 years behind schedule, $17 billion over budget. It's really hard to convince a utility to bet their entire company on one project, one mega infrastructure project. So it's unlikely that is going to all of a sudden accelerate the building of a bunch of plants in the near term. Now, natural gas plants are a clean burning fuel, and many of you support, obviously, enable that. And I think we should build a lot of natural gas plants ultimately. However, what you and I think ultimately doesn't even matter in the sense that many of these Fortune 500 companies like the Googles and Microsofts and Amazons, they have these very strict emission reduction goals. And unfortunately, they don't consider natural gas a clean energy resource. So it doesn't count towards that metric. So what is the solution? Well, obviously we're biased. We think that advanced reactors and this smaller approach is the solution. Historically, the industry has really faced three big challenges. And Jake hit on some of these in terms of how we've overcome them in the design. But the first is high upfront costs. This has really historically plagued the nuclear power industry. Long build times and then safety concerns. Now, arguably, the nuclear industry is one of the safest industries on Earth, both for occupational lens of the worker safety as well as the community. I mean, in 70 years of commercial operation in the United States, there's been one accident and no one was hurt. I mean, the amount of radiation that was released at 3 Mile Island is the equivalent of going on a hike in the Rocky Mountains. And so what are we even talking about when we're talking about the safety concerns? But we have to bring people along. We got to educate them and really engage these stakeholders. So as Jake alluded to, the entire genesis of Oklo was to solve these big challenges. How do you overcome them? How do you build plants that are cost efficient, quick to build, and publicly accepted? And I'm not going to go through all the nuance here, but I do want to highlight a few things. So when we talk about speed, what are we talking about? Well, business models change industries. So we saw this with Amazon, Amazon Web Services. So when they started to offer compute as a service, before that, if you were a Fortune 500 company or a company that basically had on-premise servers, you had to invest a bunch of capital to buy a bunch of servers, hire a bunch of people to basically configure and rack those servers, test those servers, operate those servers, replace them over time, and then ultimately get rid of them, right? Well, that takes a lot of time, a lot of resources, and a lot of effort. All of a sudden, Amazon said, well, what about if we just offer compute as a service? You guys don't have to expend all that capital and all that labor, and people can just basically sign up and on demand instantly access compute. Well, that is very similar to what Oklo is doing for electricity and industrial heat. We are offering energy as a service to a whole new cohort of customers that couldn't access this. I mean, utilities were really the only customer for nuclear power in the past, right? You couldn't, if you were a data center or a factory or an industrial site, you couldn't just access nuclear power and the qualities of this energy. And so this business model, I believe, is going to completely and radically transform the industry, similar to how AWS transformed cloud services. Let's talk about speed. Typically, to build a large nuclear plant can take, well, generally on the 7 to 10 years, but in the West, recently, it's been much worse than that, unfortunately. We are looking, not our first plant, obviously, because we got to build momentum here, but what we're envisioning is once we're really up and running, that from a signed power purchase agreement to commercial operation date is somewhere around 36 months. That's a radically different paradigm. That's all enabled by all the things that Jake talked about in terms of factory prefabrication, minimal civil works, using commonly available materials. And when we talk about cost, we have to think about this similar to what Elon Musk did with SpaceX. When he started SpaceX and they thought, well, rockets are ridiculously expensive, right? He said, well, why? Why are rockets so expensive? Let's deconstruct every part and every material in a rocket and understand how much it actually should cost to build this rocket, right? Well, when he did it, there was a huge delta between these few companies that were making rockets and what NASA was doing versus what he could do. And we're doing something similar, thinking from first principles. When Jake and Carolyn looked at, well, what are all the materials that go into this? And why is this costing so much? Because it shouldn't. It doesn't have to. So when you think from first principles and do cost engineering up front, it's embarrassing to say, a lot of people in the nuclear industry, they don't think about cost up front. They're not used to that mindset. They don't think about cost engineering from day one. 24/7 clean energy is incredibly in demand, and Jake talked about some of the aspects of it. Obviously, it has to be flexible and reliable, etc. So we have some exciting traction with customers, and that's what I want to get into a little bit more. So we recently signed a LOI with Diamondback Energy for an initial deployment in the Permian Basin. We did a similar event to this in Midland in the fall of last year, thanks to Chris and team. And through that, we made some amazing connections, and this is just the first of several announcements that are going to be coming out soon that with traction oil and gas. Because as you all know, you got to reduce the emissions. The Permian Basin is going to 3 to 4x the amount of electricity it's going to need as you electrify all the frac fleets and all the compression and all the various aspects of operations. And so this is a tool to help the oil and gas industry reduce emissions. Data centers are our number one category. We're really excited about this partnership with Equinix. If you don't know, Equinix is the largest co-location data center company in the world. The number one. They're huge. There are 250 or so data centers around the world. And co-location data centers basically just means that they build these massive buildings with lots of servers in them, and then they lease out the space to a number of different parties to operate within their buildings. So when we talk about impact, and Jake started off with energy density is the kind of cornerstone or keystone of all of this. And when you compare the materials intensity and land intensity of advanced nuclear and nuclear in general with all of the other categories and energy sources, it just wins hands down. Here's an example. So I think it was 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago in China, they just turned on the world's largest solar project. It was 5 gigawatts of solar. Anyone have a guess of how much land that 5 gigawatts of solar took up? Any brave souls want to guess? A lot, yes. 200,000 acres. 200,000 acres for one solar project. Think about the environmental impact of that. Now, what if Oklo deployed our advanced reactors to do that same 5 gigawatts? 200 acres. 200 acres, 200,000 acres. Okay, so when you talk about environmental footprint, think about all the materials, all the diesel fuel, all the moving of those parts and components, ultimately the installation and the land impact, and then the disposal and the waste of all of that. So that shows how dense and how concentrated this energy form is. This is another example in Arizona, just to bring it a little closer to home. If you were to have put a 250 megawatt deployment in Arizona with the best solar values in the United States, you'd be looking at about 1,350 acres. We can do it on about 9 acres. Water. This is obviously becoming more and more acute issue. We use, as Jake mentioned, liquid metal as our coolant, so we don't use any water for cooling. Now, we do use some water because we have a Rankine-style steam turbine, so we need to make up water for that turbine, but it's about 15 gallons a megawatt hour. And you can see in comparison to a combined cycle natural gas plant or a traditional nuclear plant, it's just orders of magnitude different. Just to level set, a solar farm, like in Arizona, would use 20 gallons a megawatt hour just to clean the water off, to clean the panels, the dirt and debris off the solar panels. So it's about the amount of a shower that's running, 2 gallons a minute is one of these is using. So we talked about that analogy with SpaceX, and I think that's really important to think from first principles and what actually it takes. And all these design decisions matter a lot. You know, the fact that we operate at fossil-fired temperatures, so we can partner with Siemens and basically use an off-the-shelf steam turbine and power conversion system. Well, some of our competitors, They have massive customized bespoke pressure vessels that have to be forged in South Korea, right? That's a very different design decision that has huge cost implications to it. And the fact that we're non-pressurized. You think about the ripple effects of that one decision, that you don't have to have all of those parts and components that are rated in under a certain pressure, right? All of these things make a huge difference. We are basically taking what was a lot of unproductive, like low productivity labor in a construction environment and pulling as much of that into a factory as we possibly can. Now, we obviously have some civil works, but it's nothing that's on the same par as what the light water reactors are. In fact, many of the small modular reactors that use light water, they actually use on a per megawatt hour basis more concrete and steel than even the large plants, right? Because they're basically shrinking down the plant, and so they have less power production, but still so much concrete and steel. And that's unfortunately where a lot of the cost overruns historically have shown up. It's in the civil works. It's in the concrete and steel. So if you can limit that, you're going to save a lot of money. And then operationally, we don't require a lot of people to run these. These are relatively automated systems. And as Jake mentioned about recycling, recycling is great because there's this, why would we waste? There's 90,000 metric tons of spent fuel sitting there that could power the US for 150 years, but why waste that? Well, there's also huge economic benefits of leveraging that material. After we get this recycling going and everything's humming along, we can cut our fuel costs by up to 80%. And that is huge because with this type of reactor design, it's kind of the inverse of the large systems, where in the large systems, fuel costs are on the order of 10% of operational costs, where depending on the size of reactor, et cetera, they can be 45 to 60% of your cost in these advanced reactor designs. So fuel costs are really critical, and recycling is an unlock to reduce that. And now, because you can co-locate right next to the data center or right next to the factory, oftentimes 40% of their energy costs are just getting the power. It's the transmission and distribution costs and all of the associated services to get the power from the power plant to the data center. Well, we just cut their bill by 40% just by showing up, just by siting right there. So there's huge cost advantages to this approach. Now, the build time is really critical. So how do we do this? Well, one of the ways that we do it is the business model enables a different licensing approach. So instead of the traditional two-step process, where, as Jake talked about in the beginning, traditionally in the nuclear industry, a designer, a reactor vendor, technology vendor would go and get their design and construction license through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and then the customer will have to go back through that process to get an operational license and all the site-specific details approved. Well, because of our business model, because we design, build, and operate, we can do it in one step, what normally would take 2 steps. It's a huge advantage in terms of time. And because we are producing a standardized product that is basically stamped out over and over and over again, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission will only look at what is new and different for a deployment. So effectively, 90% of our license applications after the first one are a copy and paste exercise. Now, you're always going to have differences of a site, right? That 10% difference, does it have wetlands? Are there endangered species on that site? Is there historic preservation issues? All of these things are important to consider, but it's much easier. Any development project needs to deal with those things. So we talked about the emissions profile. Obviously, greenhouse gas emissions are driving a lot of the policy. And when you look at the profile of nuclear, nothing beats nuclear power in terms of the life cycle CO2 emissions of a plant. And even if you look at the data from a safety perspective, it's one of the safest ways to generate electricity. There's been a surge in public support for this. I think part of this is that people don't like massive infrastructure in their backyard. The fact that these are smaller, that they have the safety profile they do, and they don't intrude visually on the community. But 75% of Americans support smaller nuclear plants in comparison to only 50% for large plants. There's a bunch of companies in this ecosystem, which we think is a good thing. We think we need a healthy ecosystem of companies that are all working to tackle different parts of the problem, because these are really solving different problems. So, for example, NuScale and X Energy and TerraPower, they're building much, much larger plants. Those are 350 megawatts and up is kind of their sweet spot in what they're targeting. Mostly they're trying to replace coal plants. But they're not going to be appropriate for things that are 50 megawatts, like what we're doing in the Permian Basin with Diamondback, 50 megawatts. It wouldn't be totally inappropriate to put one of these larger plants on that site. So our timeline, so this comes up, well, when is this going to happen? So we're looking to, our first commercial operated plant would be by end of 2027. Jake mentioned it, at Idaho National Lab is what we're looking at for our first deployment. However, we're going to be submitting multiple applications to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission over the next 12 to 24 months for a whole series of projects. There's a very large pipeline of projects that has been growing, and we're really excited to start rolling this out. So just real quickly, and then we'll get into your questions, in terms of how do we actually work with customers? So we work with Diamondback or Equinix or some of these other companies. How does that process, what does that actually look like? So the first thing is we identify site, understand is there land available, or do we need to buy adjacent land or nearby land to power that site? What are the power requirements? What are the resiliency requirements? We then can develop budgetary pricing in relatively quickly. In about a week, we can develop budget once we have those few inputs. Then we sign a non-binding letter of intent. That enables us to commit more engineering resources and really think about, okay, where would we place these powerhouses on the site? How do we interconnect to the grid if necessary, or to the load? And then ultimately we look to sign a power purchase agreement. So that's kind of our process of how we typically work with customers. And with that, I know, Jake, why don't you come back up and let's hear some of your questions, because I'm sure you guys have many. Who wants to go first?
They've got Mike still running around, I know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sick. Right there, back.
Hello, I am curious about, with the connections with now AltCorp, Sam Altman kind of backing Oklo and specifically his background in tech, how do you think the mantra of tech of the fail fast, fail often will impact how you guys produce your products, especially with regards to with regards to licensing and safety?
Yeah, so Sam's been with us since before the company was even created. Thankfully, got the chance to know Sam 11 plus years ago. Became a friend, a mentor, then a first investor and chair of our board, and has continued that way. I stayed with us on the private side. When we decided to go public and decided to work with, he recused himself from the transactional side, and despite us ultimately merging with his SPAC. Sam's been a very, I don't know, he's a fantastically smart, very curious person who drives, I think, a pretty strong focus and discipline on trying to solve the main things that matter to find where you find the right market fit and scale. It's been, I think, useful for us. I think fail fast is a view that makes a lot of sense when you do internal work and iteration dynamics, when cost of sort of what you're developing is cheap. When you're actually using real hardware, that's different. You need to be smarter about it, right? Because you can't exactly just undo cutting a bunch of steel that didn't work, and it's expensive, right? You lose time on those things. He has always got that. So that's never been really a dynamic in hand. But taking a highly iterative approach on the design side, a big thing that's important to what we developed at Oklo is our internal sort of digital engineering and design capabilities. We have some pretty fantastic in-house things there that when we've hired folks from SpaceX and from Tesla and from some other companies, they all commented, man, I wish I had that capability when I was at my prior job. So that's been pretty cool to see, and that's obviously been, I think, a manifestation of tech's approach on that and how we've tried to implement that at the company level, but also on the regulatory front. We've taken a long view that the typical nuclear approach could speculate for a long time what the regulator is going to want and never talk to them. And we were the first of these sort of non-light water companies to formally start engaging them in 2016 and got in real quick to just say, okay, here's what we're thinking, and put some really aggressive views out there. We try to take a bunch of steps forward on some things. We see some pushback in some areas, but mostly we find that that's how you actually get things done. What we've learned is that they actually are quite responsive to being pretty aggressive and forward and driving new things and thinking differently if you give them some time to process it. So it's good that we spent as much time. It's been 8 years plus that we've invested in with them. So I think that's how we've implemented some of that mantra.
You mentioned using waste fuel. I mean, how much the fuel that you would need would have to be mined. And, are you looking at where that would happen and, what kind of, challenges, because it's not.
Yeah, at a global scale, you could, and this is abstract, I know, and it's exciting. It's exciting to talk about. Well, let's just talk about the U.S. actually. So there's enough uranium that's pulled out of the ground, either in the form of depleted uranium from the byproducts of enrichment and the used fuel, that you could power the entire country without pulling another, atom of uranium out of the ground for about 1,000 years. So you don't need to for a while, but we will, just because the economics will dictate doing some of that. One thing that's nice is because the material, the fuel is so energy dense, the mining impact is very small, right? In fact, I think there's some it's actually a negative. This is going to sound funny, but it's actually been a negative to the development of more cost-effective production techniques for nuclear because it's so energy dense that it just hasn't spurred as much innovation that you've seen that's happened in other mineral extraction approaches. So I think, at scale of usage, you'll see some more benefits that come that way. But at the end of the day, where that converges to is ultimately just ocean uranium harvesting. So there's enough of a concentration of uranium thorium that's just in the ocean from erosion and from dissolution of bedrock in the ocean that you can actually pull that material out. And with our approach, that's actually cost competitive at scale. That's kind of what the end state is, but I don't think that's going to be the end state of interest for about 150 or 200 years. So it's kind of that's what's great about a material that's just so incredibly energy dense. It's just the mining part is pretty small.
The bottleneck right now is enrichment. So there's plenty of uranium around and there's plenty of waste, but do we have the facilities to enrich it to a level that we can use it, right? And so I think based upon the amount of demand that we're seeing, which is really unprecedented, we're going to have to rely on fresh fuel and recycled fuel for the near future. I mean, it's as I mentioned, because there's huge financial incentive for us to recycle as fast as possible and as much as possible. But I think just the sheer demand, the overwhelming demand for power is going to necessitate all means necessary. We're going to need as much fresh fuel and as much recycled fuel as we can get, at least for the foreseeable future.
But Brian, elaborate on that enrichment question. That's something that we shrunk our capability to do that in the United States. What's the time frame to fix that problem?
We as a country used to have more enrichment capacity than the rest of the world combined in the 80s. In the fall of the Soviet Union, we focused on helping get rid of, isolate, contain, and get rid of a lot of the excess weapons materials from the Soviet Union. So for about 20 years up until the early or mid-2010s, about 10% of all electrons used in the U.S. were generated from splitting uranium that was originally enriched to blow up our cities by the Soviet Union. So it's kind of cool that was a story. But the problem was we abdicated our enrichment capacity to support doing that. We let it atrophy. So now there's a big spin up to kick that into gear. It's been a bit of a slow process, but thankfully, after there was we've been relying on Russia for 18% of our enriched, basically uranium capacity or enrichment capacity. Now there's a ban in place about that. That's spurring a massive reindustrialization and scale up of enrichment in the U.S. That you're seeing expansion from multiple players. Right now, we have a partnership with Centrus, which we view as kind of the lead in that game. There's some other newer, possibly more competitive and disruptive ones that are a little differentiated in their timescales from technology development. That could be pretty cool, but we've taken a pretty broad approach on partnering with different groups there. We expect Centrus, which has a facility in Ohio, they're already producing this material today. It's too small of quantities for what we need. We need more faster is kind of the mantra. But they're in the process of scaling that up to hopefully be producing at more meaningful scales come 2028 and beyond so that can support some of our build up and scale out. But we're going to need more than what they can just do, which is where then excess materials that the government has and others might help stopgap that. But or they're just going to have to grow faster than sort of what it looks like today. They'll do, in other words, just grow faster, which is great. But that's kind of what that's looking like. So it is good that it's being produced today. We're going to hope to then see how quickly they can expand that into 2027, 28, 29, 2030, and beyond.
And in addition to the ban on Russian enrichment, part of that, the U.S. government has basically funded $2.7 billion to force basically domestic enrichment to happen, to enable that to happen. So there's a huge alignment between the government and industry and demand right now, where everything is converging on, everyone realizes this is a problem and we need to invest now, and they are. In addition, we are building our own full-scale recycling facility, and we're in pre-application right now with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. In terms of the question about how hard is it going to be to site, it's actually quite the opposite. We have states competing for the facility because it's a huge economic development engine for the local community because there's hundreds of jobs that will be associated with that recycling facility. So it's quite the opposite. We're running a competitive process to see who gives us the best incentives. And there's about a half a dozen states at least that are interested. So it's not going to be a problem to cite it. Obviously, we need to get through all the hoops and hurdles with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but from a state's perspective, they want it.
When you're talking about pre-science,
No. So in used fuel, what it is about 3 to 5% fission products, sort of byproducts of the fission process, about 1% uranium-235, and the rest, which is about 93-ish% uranium-230. Sorry, I said that wrong. 1% uranium-235, about 2% transuranics, and then the rest, which is about 93% uranium-238. What you do is you actually pull out that transuranic part that makes up between 1, 2, 3%, depending on sort of the age of the fuel. It's like wines of different vintages you pull out and mix. The transuranics, what that is, those are the materials on the periodic table to the bottom, to the right of the periodic table that you rarely ever talk about. Things like neptunium, plutonium, americium, curium, things like that. Those are really good replacements directly for uranium-235, which is the isotope that we use for fuel and reactors that we enrich for. So you can actually pull that out and then concentrate it up and mix it with uranium. So you're not doing any enrichment. The fuel's kind of pre-enriched for you. You just have to separate it using an electrochemical process where you basically dissolve it in a bath of salts and metals and then apply a current across different voltages. That separates these out based on their electropotential. And those transuranics come out with some uranium, add some more uranium into it, and then you have fuel that can be a direct replacement for enriched uranium. And because of that, that's part of why it's so much cheaper. You don't have to put all the energy into enriching that you would otherwise do.
There's actually a really excellent 2-minute video. If you go to oklo.com and go to fuel recycling and watch the 2-minute video there, it'll describe the entire process of how you do what Jake just described, but in very good visuals, and it'll walk you through it.
Yeah, better than what, good descriptor.
Question?
you mentioned that the spent fuel was still like 95% uranium-38. So does that mean you brought out fuel at the Lane Bridge 5%, 235?
So today's reactors typically have fuel enriched to between 3 and 4.5, 4.95 enriched percent enriched uranium-235. They run and they use about 5% of the fuel, not because of that number. It's a little bit because of that number. It's sort of a co-iterative process. The reason ultimately is you can run longer. You just need to add more fuel. It doesn't necessarily have to be more enriched, but it comes within having more complex control systems that come at higher cost. So there's sort of this generalized, and this is a little simplistic, but sort of like optimal number for most reactors that only use about between 4, 5, maybe 6% of the fuel in a pass, above which naval reactors run much longer, but it comes at much greater cost, above which it just becomes not cost competitive to do so. So that's kind of why it's only about 5% unused, and it's below that point that you don't have enough fuel to sustain the reaction anymore. To offset it, you would have to add more fuel, which would come at more cost because you have to have more control systems. So that's kind of why it settles at that level. And that's true for most reactor designs. Then though, when you recycle it, what you're pulling out then is that unused fuel that you eventually can fully use. Now, the interesting thing about uranium is 0.7% of it coming out of the ground is uranium-235. 99.3% is uranium-238. Uranium-235 is the really good stuff. Uranium-238, though, is kind of like wet wood. It can really burn well if you let it dry out. It's a weird way of describing it, but you dry it out by exposing it to neutrons in a reactor. And because of that, what happens is uranium-238 absorbs neutrons, turns into plutonium-239 or plutonium-240 or americium-241 or various isotopes of these transuranics that are very good. In fact, a better fuel than uranium-235 is even. So that's where you can get to these perspectives where you can actually start using all the uranium-238. Additional super side kind of nerdy fact, in our reactor, fast neutrons have enough energy to actually quasi-efficiently fission uranium-238. So we get about 15% of our power just from the direct fission of uranium-238, which is kind of cool. But then other uranium-238 actually turns into other usable things that you can recycle and continue to use.
Question.
Uranium-38, that's similar to that design with energy both the firms 238.
Yeah, they don't. So what they do is they're just very, very neutron efficient, but they only use the small amount of uranium-238, 235 that you can put in naturally. But that comes at higher fuel costs. So they only use like 0.5% or so of the fuel energy content that goes in just because it's not enriched. So they don't directly use U-238.
It's a question here.
About commercial side, your smaller plant or your largest plant, what's it going to cost you there? produce kilowatt hour? What kind of market?
Yeah, well, I'm going to answer your question directly, but I want to give you a couple caveats. So like anything, it depends, right? I mean, it depends on the scale. Are we talking about a 15 megawatt plant, 500 megawatt plant, 1,000?
We talked about two different size plants, 50 and...
Oh, well, I'm glad you brought this up because this is, I think, a misconception. Most of our deployments are hundreds of megawatts. Most data centers are looking at 300 megawatts, 500 megawatts. You should really view our individual powerhouses as Lego blocks, and you're just adding additional Lego blocks as you go. So it's actually rare that we will have a deployment with just 150 megawatt plant. But I'm going to answer your question directly. But I want to give an example because it really depends on the economies of scale. If you're building a 500 megawatt, if you're serving a 500 megawatt data center campus, that's very different than a 15 megawatt deployment. It also depends on the land cost. Northern Virginia, land goes for $3 to $4 million an acre. In Southern Ohio, it's $20,000, $30,000 an acre. So all of these things factor into cost, and there isn't one perfect formula. But what we're seeing in general, in terms of in the U.S., exclude Alaska and Hawaii and international stuff, is you're going to be somewhere in the range of, let's say, 8.5 cents to 11 cents a kilowatt hour, somewhere in that ballpark for cost, depending on those factors.
And your business model is basically building for specific customers, or are you going to ultimately feed into a national?
Yeah, we're not a merchant power plant. Our business model is primarily focused on signing these long-term power purchase agreements with off-takers, be it customers. Now, we can have a plant with multiple off-takers, and we're engaged on that right now. We have a data center customer that wants 200 megawatts of power, but they're also going to let us build on their land for up to additional 300 megawatts or so, and then we can execute additional offtake agreements. So there's a whole series of scenarios. Sometimes we're just dedicated for that customer behind the meter. Sometimes we'll do both in the hybrid model. And then sometimes we might build a plant in an area where we know there's multiple customers on our own property and have multiple offtake agreements serving them.
When do you see cash flow break even?
Yeah, an interesting thing on the business side. So
Restate the question just so.
The question is, when do we see cash flow break even? A real cool thing about this story is, yes, while we have a lot of sort of capital requirements to finance, build, and operate these things, the recurring revenues of a PPA are something you can finance against. But you're not financing against just the asset cost. You're financing against the value of the PPA. And what that means is you might do a 30%, 70% loan to value kind of project finance. So take out debt on that against the PPA. Let's just say the plant costs $70 million, but the PPA value is $300 million. So you're actually pulling in, right, like quite a bit of capital to the business to help grow beyond just building it, because you might be pulling in $210 million on sort of debt terms to help build. So that obviously pays for one plant and more on top. So that's a huge scaling function for us, and something that the market understands well. They do this at, hundreds of billions of dollars a year flow in project finance for renewable energy. So it's something we can tap into, which is fantastic. On top of that, we have right now, there's a 250% investment tax credit. And what that means, though, is it's not just a tax credit against your profits. It's actually literally basically a 30 to 50% kickback in the cost of the project the day you start generating power. So you get that immediately into the business as soon as you start turning these things on, and then you can reinvest that. So all in all, like, that creates a pretty favorable cash dynamic out. So come sort of the 2029, 2030 timeframe, we look at how you could get there. But what that also means, there's a lot of knobs you can turn for what make the most sense for the business. And so it's going to depend on where we want to get to and what we're doing from a scale perspective. Right now, what we see is so much scale and growth. It feels like the market's going to suck up every single megawatt hour we can deliver. So we're going to be reinvesting everything we can to just scale faster is kind of how we look at that.
This business model is amazing when you think about it. What other business can you think of? And I can't think of another one where you're basically locking in 20 years of reoccurring revenue that's guaranteed, that basically you're going to be generating power for 24/7 so you have a guaranteed term, guaranteed price, guaranteed return on that reoccurring revenue. I mean, it's unbelievable. And these are the biggest companies in the world. So you have the largest market in the world, the biggest companies in the world, paying you 20 years of reoccurring revenue guaranteed. I mean, it's hard to beat a business model like that. I think there's a question back there.
Yeah, can you talk about what your security concerns are, your terrorism, just how vulnerable are these facilities going to be?
Great thing about putting the question about like safety, security, and terrorism and considerations. One of the great things about putting all the physics of the safety of the system sort of on your side by design really simplifies the design, but also really eliminates a lot of the threat points that could be attacked to cause some kind of problem. You can't really turn off gravity, right? Things like that. So that works really favorable for us. The system is embedded, it's buried in the ground, it's embedded, it's very structurally, so basically very structurally sort of robust by design, because regulatory requirements include designing against and analyzing against these kind of threats. And so the design threats that we have to analyze against, we basically achieve through sort of design means by offset distance and by sort of structure and by emplacement, as well as by what the features of the system look like. And then the other is sort of by intervention, what can happen. Because the plant really will shut itself down and resist any kind of attempts to turn it on. So like if you try to drive power up on the system, it'll literally turn itself off. That gives you a lot of sort of robustness against external threats. So we don't have an on-site security force that you would see at big nuclear power plants, partly because of these features, partly also because being small also reduces the total amount of material on site. So in addition to the great features of the system, it's also just what's, sort of source material mitigated by not having that much of it. And the analog that proves this out is that research reactors around the country today, in fact, there's one in Denver, close, not too far away. There was one in the middle of Cambridge, Massachusetts, that we looked across at MIT. There's these small research reactors that are smaller in size, but you're still like MIT's is a 5+ megawatt reactor, and it uses highly enriched uranium. And it was a system that doesn't have a permanent on-site security force, relies on similar kind of approaches. And so you rely on external security to provide an intervention approach if you need it, but you don't need it on site. So that gives you a lot of like efficiency about what these things look like from a security perspective by design.
I'll test out your microphone. Some of the things that you've shown, it's great that they were proven a long time ago. Using that kind of technology can allow you to get your plants built a lot faster. You don't have to reprove things. But what improvements are you looking at? Like they used to build rocket ships, tanks for rockets one way. Now they 3D print them. What kind of technology are you using that's specific to Oklo that will improve the, technology on these plants?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because there's always an opportunity for further enhancement improvement. We feel like there's a lot that we just get out through doing and keeping it simple that gives us all the cost benefits we really need. But there are future improvements. Recycling is one. So you're replacing the enriched uranium with transuranics, that gives you some benefits. But there's some things at the fuel level. There's these things called additives in the fuel side, not additive manufacturing. So 3D printing is not a good idea in a system like this or mini reactor system, I would say, except for small components because it's not needed. If you need it, you've probably done something wrong on the design side because you're exotic and expensive. You shouldn't do that. The fuel side, you can have these additives to the fuel that help allow it to run for longer and for higher temperatures. There's some cladding enhancements that we've looked at, some co-extrusion techniques on the cladding. Cladding is the tube. So right now it's stainless steel 316L that goes around the fuel. There are other alloys that have some potential benefits there, but right now they're not made in a significant enough scale to want to rest our early deployments on. But that could improve performance, allow the system to run perhaps slightly to higher temperatures or even the fuel to run a little bit longer. These things really start to add up when we think about the long-term cases for Oklo, but all these things give you a couple % performance benefits, and by the time you compile them up, you see some opportunities for enhancement there. Additionally, there's some benefits on the instrumentation and control side of things. A lot of the instrumentation we use, and what instrumentation looks like here, temperature meters, those are pretty standard. That's not exotic stuff. There's a lot of great advancements that have happened in the last 30 years we already draw from. But detecting like the radiation signatures from the nuclear fuel is what you do to monitor the core. So that's detecting neutrons and photons. There's a lot of really cool advances that have happened there that are not qualified for use in a reactor yet, is what I would say. So we don't need them, but we're excited about what they could do because they could help drop costs of the system over time. And so we're looking at what some of those look like. And we very much view our first plant that we're building in Idaho as a test bed that will have some flexibility to actually test these things out in. In fact, the government gave us some funding to actually look at doing that with that plant. So that can help us qualify some of these next generation approaches for all sorts of these kinds of different things. Additionally, there's some interesting things on paper on the pump side Not clear exactly if it's going to manifest in terms of a real benefit, but those are some things we think about on the sort of like 5, 10, 20-year horizons and sometimes beyond.
Software too.
Yeah, and software. I mean, honestly, one of the biggest things right now is software. One of the things that's really catalyzed the shift in the nuclear movement. It's never been cheaper than it is now to design a new nuclear reactor, thanks to modeling and software capabilities we have. Look at what you can do computationally. When I started out in this space, I mean, what we could do on sort of like workstations that were, man, $40,000 machines is dwarfed by what I can do on my laptop today, right? And that was only 20 years ago. I mean, it's insane the advances that have happened, the things we can do, as well as the actual bringing forward good software approaches and engineers that we've been able to attract into the company. That's fantastic for how we've streamlined the design process. And then how that manifests into the control side and how you actually can build. This term kind of annoys me sometimes because I think it's overused, but digital twinning, like you can really do some really cool stuff that way. And actually benefit things from how you improve operations and maintenance and everything else.
What are the needed personnel to replace the reactor fuel rods? And also, will that process be contracted out to another company, or will Oklo do it themselves?
So the staffing to refuel, that's the question, is how we do that. Yeah. So there's a whole industry about rotating refueling squads for existing nuclear plants. We very much intend to leverage those as well as bring it in-house in the best ways possible. So early plants will contract that out and use that to co-develop internally, and then over time we'll just develop it ourselves to fully do in-house. But we expect the process to be something that we can reduce pretty considerably over the time scale needed to actually be able to, swap material. When you refuel, you're refueling about half the core. So that's what the design point is. You pull out half the fuel rods, replace them with new ones, and then run again for another 10 years and go from there.
Well, a great presentation. Very exciting. I make documentary films. I look at it a little bit differently. I've done 2 about nuclear power. So are you worried about the anti-nuclear, the environmental opposition to these plants? It killed recycling last time in the 70s and 80s. So even if there's public support, it doesn't mean that there's not a very activist group that's very committed to stopping nuclear power. Are you worried about that with these next generation plants in general, not just yours alone?
Yeah, I mean, a little, but not so much. I think there's a big shift that's been occurring for a couple of reasons. One is I think a lot of the environmental groups have been going through a significant amount of evolution internally. Some are still very regressive for sure. They're just anti-energy, full stop. I think a lot of others realize, though, from a climate perspective and a reality perspective, if they actually want solutions, they realize the importance nuclear has. And I think we've seen a lot of environmental groups prioritize conservation and climate, and as a result, come to a conclusion that nuclear is quite important. And we're seeing some of those groups stand up, and including new environmental groups stand up that are actually very supportive of nuclear. It was a grassroots effort that saved the Diablo Canyon power plant in California, largely driven by what I would call like an environmental, 2.0 or 3.0, whatever you want to call it, movement that I think was focused on the benefits that these systems afford. So I also think there's a demographic shift that's occurring. I think sort of the younger generations that are growing up in this space, their primary focus in many ways of what we see, and this is anecdotal, but is largely geared towards climate. And as a result, there's a huge amount of support for nuclear. I think we've also seen that manifest in real world ways. Nature Conservancy is wanting to more than double or triple nuclear capacity, actively advocating for that. Sierra Club is not protesting at some of the, in fact, they even joined to support some nuclear extensions of the operating plants. I don't think you're going to see some of those groups out fully supporting new builds, but they may not be opposing them, which is maybe just as good. And I think, or better, because some of their branding isn't very good. But I think it's an evolving space that I think is supportive of this. I think on recycling, I wouldn't blame I actually wouldn't say it was the environmental movement. It was really the economics of it. Recycling for today's reactors is economically very, very challenging. That's, I think, what really dictates a lot of the like why that didn't take off.
It did it.
Right, they did, but there's a different view on the economics there. We as a country enacted a nuclear waste policy that very significantly subsidizes waste management by the taxpayers. France doesn't have that same policy. So the costs are more direct to industry and transparent. That would be my view, and I would argue pretty strongly about that. So that is kind of why I think in many ways the value or cost of recycling in France is more approachable than it is in the US. That said, it's a very different paradigm. for fast reactors and with recycling techniques we're doing, you take a simpler, dirtier fuel product for fast reactors. That means it's cheaper to produce. That means the facilities are smaller, simpler, cheaper. All of that kind of comes to bear in a productive way, and you're competing against a higher cost fuel form than today's reactors have. So overall, recycling becomes economically very viable. You can't do that with today's reactors. They need a high purity plutonium product, and that's just very expensive to make.
The whole political climate is completely transformed today. I mean, this is one of the very few bipartisan issues. I mean, they just passed new legislation, even just last week, that whether it's Biden or Trump, they both support nuclear power. So at the federal level, there's a lot of political support for nuclear. On the local level, you're right. We do need to be out there educating people early because there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of misconceptions. So we're already doing this on the ground. So we've publicly announced 2 plants in Ohio. We've gone there. We're engaging the community well before we even submit a license application. We invite in all of the elected officials, workforce organizations, NGOs, environmental groups, and we bring them in a room because we want to be as transparent as possible because the 2 things, they only care about 2 things, really. Is it safe? And what about the waste? I'm oversimplifying, but that's generally what the public cares about. Those are off the table. Like, we're recycling the waste, so we're solving a problem, and then these reactors can't melt down. So what are you even talking about here? Because they're completely safe and self-regulating and self-cooling. So their 2 arguments are actually non-arguments. They're not valid anymore given this approach and this technology. But we do need to do a lot of early education, a lot of stakeholder engagement. We can't assume people understand this. We got to bring them along. And so we believe to be as transparent and upfront as possible and do a lot of early education. It's going to be really important because you're right. There is a lot of kind of unsubstantiated fear out there that we need to educate people on.
Maybe mentioned a couple of the LOIs that you got. What are the stuff that we're waiting for in terms of them to fully execute it? Yeah, are they waiting to see you build these things to generate out, or then permitting, or?
Good question. So the question is, are our customers waiting? We have these letter of intent. Are they waiting for some kind of milestone like licensing? No. So we are negotiating power purchase agreements right now. We actually, once we sign the power purchase agreement, is the key milestone that kicks off an application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It kicks off efforts for project finance. It kicks off ordering long lead items. So no, they're not waiting on anything. It's just a matter of hashing through all the legal terms and conditions, figuring out powerhouse placement on the site, interconnection issues. We're estimating it'll take between 6 to 9 months on average between a signed LOI and a signed power purchase agreement, depending on the size of the organization, the scale of the project, complexity. But that's kind of what we're well on the way. We're going to be signing PPAs very shortly.
Okay, and so the one they're building it, I got a couple that should have built there.
First one, yeah.
But you're fully capitalized to build that. And that, what's the major barrier to, you said 2029, you're going to target leading?
Yep. 2027. Yeah, I mean,
Okay. Bidding.
yeah. So there's 2 main long poles in that tent that are about equal length right now. One is on the permitting. The other is on we have fuel for that plant was awarded to us through a competitive process by the Idaho National Laboratory and the Department of Energy. That fuel is being produced as we speak. It's at a small scale facility. It's a recycling facility operating in Idaho. The rate of production of that facility is pretty low, and we have to fabricate that fuel into our system. And that matching up of sort of fabrication timelines and production timelines, about the same length of time as the regulatory at this point. So if you ask me what keeps me up more at night, it's actually the fuel side on that, just because it's less in our direct control than the regulatory. But regulatory is also not perfectly in our control, but that's how we see it.
Question?
How do you plan on training and staffing operators, especially given that this is basically a novel design and that there isn't a lot of experience in operating your type of reactor?
Yeah, I mean, we actually just started up someone yesterday who's an operator at a plant, the sodium plant, the FFTF plant, right? So like people out there do have experience. Those people are around. They're getting more senior in age, but you can draw those lessons learned. We've also brought in an operating staff built off. I think the best analog to build off of is the Naval Nuclear Program. And so we've brought in folks from the Naval Nuclear Program as well as senior reactor operators to build up that operational side. But the operational job of the system is really pretty easy. It's more complex from the steam plant than it is from the nuclear plant because the nuclear plant just follows the steam plant. literally the nuclear plant, you don't really have to do anything after startup. It follows naturally the load response of the steam plant, and so it's actually a pretty straightforward piece.
Well, I guess also I'm curious about how the scaling of that's going to work when you try to implement, say, you're trying to create, say 500 megawatts worth of power at one site. And how many operators do you need to make that work? And then as you build multiple sites, do you have that capability to scale all of those operators among the different areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is like operating nuclear plants, like these systems are far easier than operating today's nuclear plants, right? So you would have an operational staff that's, even at like a 500 megawatt basis, you're looking at usually about 2 operators per plant. And there's some scaling you can get if you package enough of these to go together. So in all reality, it's and like the requirements here are pretty straightforward to train someone up in less than a year, I would say, maybe 2 years at most. I don't even see that taking that long. Sorry, I don't even know why I said 2 years. It's like a year. I mean, it's a pretty fast trained program, and you don't need a lot of credentials. You don't need to have these are folks you mostly are going to be hiring out of the Navy, and pivoting them to know how to operate these systems will be pretty fast work.
All right, last question, stick it with the UZ.
I'm just wondering, do you have a sort of back of the envelope sense of, with your business model, these direct purchasing agreements, having fixed number of reactors servicing directly a customer, just sort of back of the envelope, what percentage of domestic electricity production could hypothetically be met by that business model, either in the future by Oklo or other companies adopting that business model? Just even order of magnitude, just what ballpark is that? I don't work in energy, so I have no idea.
I don't know, maybe I'm over 100. You can meet 100%. I don't see any reason you couldn't. I mean, that's, I know that sounds crazy. I don't know.
There's just going to have to be massive scaling of the supply chain, fuel and all that. But, from a theoretical perspective, you could tackle certainly a large part of the electricity market, and then a lot of the industrial heat side as well. I think most of this is just, and we're growing. So we're good. I mean, today there's about 100 gigawatts of nuclear power in the United States operating today. And according to the Department of Energy says we want to triple that by 2050. So there's going to go to basically 300 by 2050. So that's a marker that's out there that the federal government has put out. I think that's kind of an arbitrary number, to be honest. I mean, I think there's no real limit on the scale of this. It's just practically how fast can the supply chain really ramp up to meet all the demand? Because the demand is there, clear.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. Appreciate it. We'll see you in the next Liberty Dinner. Doc, walk up to the stage and you still got more questions.
And thank you to the Liberty team,
yes.
Ivy, Audrey, Izzy, Chris. It takes a lot of work, obviously, to put these events together. So thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it.